All right, so for today's remote lesson, gonna focus once again on grammar. So I'm gonna go over the remaining run-on sections. So I've already talked about this first little practice activity. We'll talk about the other run-ons, talk about apostrophes and go over the answers for that, and then explain the next 2 pages, which hopefully you'll find pretty straightforward. So as far as answers go for practice activity part 2, the key to this section was really just finding the separation point between the end of the first sentence and the beginning of the second sentence. Once you have that, hopefully the instructions in parentheses made it pretty easy for how to fix it, but I will talk about most of them anyways. So this first one, movies entertain millions of people every day. They are popular all over the world. So hopefully you were able to kind of hear that the best place for a period to go is right after day, and that would mean you'd have to capitalize the T in they, and voila, run-on fixed. Number 2, many films take years to make. They require the skills of hundreds of workers. So your location was here, but this time you're using a comma and a conjunction. And there's a few conjunction options. So if you don't use the one that I use, then, that's probably still okay. But I typically would use and in this location. I think it sounds best since you're linking to similar ideas, but you could definitely make some others work. All right, so for 3, the director of a movie has an important job. The cast and crew all follow the director's instructions. So the best place for your semicolon is right after that first thought, the information about what an important job the director has. You put your little semicolon there. You do not capitalize the beginning of the next sentence because you don't do that with semicolons. For the 4th one, the director makes many decisions. The producers take care of the business end of movie making. So right after decisions is where your semicolon is going to need to go, but this time you're adding a little something extra here. So we're going to add in the word however, which is very hard to write out, and make sure that you did not accidentally capitalize. However, it is lowercase because it's after the semicolon. But after the R in however, you would have a comma. So however is one of those introductory words where whenever you use it in a sentence, it's always going to have a comma after it. So that's just standard practice there. Okay, so now that we've talked about those first 4, that covers all of our different circumstances. I'm just going to talk about ones that were maybe a little tricky. Number 7 trips people up sometimes. I think it's mostly because of this long, scary word, kinetoscope. So anyways, the machine was called a kinetoscope. It was a cabinet that showed moving images through a peephole. So as long as you didn't let that word throw you off, hopefully you found the period right after kinetoscope and capitalized the I. Okay, number 8 I think is kind of tricky to find the location. Initially, a lot of people are tempted to put their comma after the word sometimes, but if you read the sentence carefully, the sentence is not saying that early movies were only silent sometimes. Early movies were silent. All of the early movies were silent. They weren't just silent sometimes, they were silent all of the time. So the sometimes is referring to the fact that sometimes off-screen actors at movie theaters would fill in the dialogue for the audience. So hopefully you found the location right after silent. I think but is a nice conjunction to use here. Early movies were silent, but sometimes off-screen actors would do the things. So if you used a different one, it's probably fine, but that one is my favorite to get across the meaning of this sentence. Okay, I think that's all for tricky ones for this page. If you have questions about ones I didn't go over, let me know. But let's talk about the next practice activity with run-ons. Some of these I do feel like have kind of tricky locations for where to put your punctuation. So we'll go over a few of these. Number one, the only thing that trips people up sometimes is this word surely. For some reason, they want it to be part of the first sentence sometimes, but really it's actually the beginning of the second sentence. Just imagine your life without TV, audio and video recordings, and movies. Surely you would spend your time quite differently from the way you do now. So the S in surely gets capitalized. Okay, number two also has a tricky location. In a world without recorded music, a musician could often attract a crowd. Even today, good musicians can make a living on the streets of a large city. So the phrase that throws people off here is this even today. For some reason, they want it to be part of the first sentence sometimes, but we're talking about a world without recorded music. That is definitely not today. Today is not a world without recorded music. So you want that to be beginning of the second sentence so that the even today goes with what music is like today, not what music used to be like. So that's where your semicolon would go. Okay. Number four, I'll go over. I don't think the location is super tricky, but just to cover again this funny looking word, consequently. Many of the settlers owned fiddles, dulcimers, flutes, and guitars. Music could be a part of everyday life. So your semicolon will go after music. And just a reminder that consequently works the same exact way as however. It does not get capitalized because you do not capitalize after a semicolon. Oh my goodness. And it's very, very long, so it's going to take me a second to write it all out. But typing it for you, I'm sure, is much, much easier than my little drawing tool here. And after the Y, and consequently, you would have a comma, just like with the word however. So make sure you have that comma there. Okay, number five, location is a little tricky. What really throws people off is this American thing. When they're still kind of smushed together like that, it's a little confusing, which is the whole point behind run-ons. Run-ons can be confusing. So I think this one, it helps a lot to read out loud. Long before the settlers arrived, there was already plenty of music in North America. American Indians prized music and song. Okay, so the separation is between America and American, which makes sense because otherwise that'd be a very, very strange phrase to have all mushed together like that. So, let's see, what else is tricky here? Number nine. Number nine throws people off sometimes. Any sentence that has a little introductory phrase, I think sometimes is tricky for people because they initially read it as a part of the first sentence without realizing it's actually meant to be the beginning of the second sentence. West Africans make banjo-like instruments out of... Oops, that's a spelling mistake. I'll have to change that. Out of gourds. For strings, they use dried animal gut. All right, so ignoring my spelling mistake, the semicolon will go here, and that'll make much more sense once I fix that spelling mistake. Goodness. Okay, so aside from my typo, hopefully this was very easy. And yeah, that hopefully helps you out with run-ons a bit. Okay. Pages 14, 15, and 16. So we talked about the apostrophe rules, and I told you about these funny sentences that you're going to end up rewriting. So for this first one, for example, this is the shoe of the girl. Well, that'd be silly and ridiculous. We would never say that. If we see a shoe and we know it belongs to a girl, we would say, this is the girl's shoe. So you'd end up having girls with an apostrophe S after it. We just have one girl, we assume, and she owns these shoes. So it would just be normal apostrophe S. Okay, now number two, is very similar to the example up here. We have a guy named James, and in number 3, we have a guy named Marcus. Now the names James and Marcus both end in an S. So to us, it sounds kind of funny to add another S right after an S, but that is the rule. So I like James's car. So here we are at James's house. He is the son of Marcus would become he is Marcus's son. So just make sure got that one. Oh, and then number 4 is very similar to this circumstance. So rather than we are at Todd and Anne's apartment, now we have Julie and Juan, but we still only put that apostrophe S after the last person. So it would be this is Julie and Juan's house. All right. Let's see. What other ones? Oh, number 6 messes people up sometimes. We have flowers and we have a plant. We are saying that the flowers are red. The flowers that are on this plant are red. So a lot of people are tempted to put an apostrophe or add an apostrophe S or some strange thing like that to, oops, I don't know how I keep doing that, to flowers. But, ignore that, but there is no apostrophe in flowers. Flowers is just plural. If something is plural, you do not put an apostrophe in it. If you have more than one flower, it's just flowers, no apostrophe necessary. So what we'd really have here is the plants. Oh my gosh. The plants' flowers are red, not, get rid of that, not, I don't know how I keep doing that, sorry. Not the flowers are red. Plants. So it's just the apostrophe S in plants. Ta-da. Okay. Let's see. And I think that's it for tricky ones on this first section. I think most of the rest of these are straightforward. So a website can belong to a college's, so that would be the college's website. All right, so on to contractions. So for this section, I told you you just had to put the contraction itself. Just a reminder on number 1, I know I mentioned this, but just make sure that anytime you are combining a word with not. So in this case, we have do not, which becomes don't. The apostrophe goes where the letters have been removed. The only letter that's been removed from do not is the O. So the apostrophe goes in between the N and the T. Okay, so other tricky ones. Number 3 sometimes throws people off because they're tempted to put WHOS and then they manufacture an E out of nowhere. That is not correct. WHOSE is only for possession. It's when something belongs to somebody. We need the contraction because we're combining who is. So we would have WHO apostrophe S. You remove the I and replace it with an apostrophe. Same kind of thing with number 4. Some people are tempted to put one of the other theirs, THERE or THEIR, but we are combining these two words. We're only using the letters from these two words. So you'd still have the they, but we remove the A, and that becomes the contraction there. Okay, for number 5, I'll just mention that there are actually 2 options here. If you combine we and are, then you would get we're with an apostrophe in the middle. Or you could combine are and not and get aren't with an apostrophe between the N and the T. And I would take either way on that one. So there's 2 possible answers for number 5. All right. The only other one I want to mention is number 10. She does not eat spinach. So most of you probably figure out the correct contraction is doesn't. The weird thing that I see here is sometimes instead of putting D-O-E-S, like does is spelled, sometimes people switch the E and the S, and they put D-O-S-E. I'm not sure why that is, but doesn't is not a word. So make sure that when you're combining these words, you do not change the order of the letters. And of course, make sure you put the apostrophe in between the N and the T. Okay, so that's all for contractions. Now, this bit was a little tricky just because you're looking for multiple situations, and I did tell you how many apostrophes you should be looking for in each of these sentences. So let's just real quick cover what those apostrophe situations should look like. Number 1 just had one apostrophe. It was when you combined is and not. That made the word isn't, and that's the only apostrophe you should have in that sentence. For number 2, you had possession. Head of the dog would end up becoming dog's head. So hopefully that was straightforward there. Now number 3 is the first one where you have 2 apostrophes. So hopefully you're able to see that that and is could become that's, that apostrophe S. And then hat of Jones would be Jones's hat. And just make sure that for the name Jones, his name is Jones, it's not Joan. So that would mean that when you're trying to talk about his hat, goodness, that you would need an apostrophe and an S after his name. So his name is not Joan. You cannot put an apostrophe in the middle of his name. All right. Number 4 was just one apostrophe. Market of the town could become town's market. So that was a possessive one. Number 5 is a little tricky just because the contraction, the words actually weren't right next to each other. So you had to look a little carefully to see that you could actually combine did and not. And then hopefully car of Bill was a little straightforward. So didn't you wash Bill's car? All right. Number 6 was just one apostrophe. Most people will change it to this wallet is Tito's or this is Tito's wallet. Either way is fine on that one. Let's see, number 7, we have 2. This one's nicer than, and instead of having all of this mess, it is nicer than Dan's. Just add a little apostrophe there for Dan's. Now, number 8 is tricky. I always ask people how many apostrophes they found. And even though I tell them there's only one, a lot of people will tell me they found 2. So for number 8, it is combines to form its. Anytime you see it apostrophe s, that is, it is. This its does not need an apostrophe. And the reason for that is it is possessive, and this is the only situation in the English language where you have a word that is the same spelling as a contraction, but it does not use the apostrophe to signify that it is possessive. So the dog chases its tail. We are saying that the tail belongs to it. The tail belongs to the dog. If you want to test it out, I said that anytime you have it apostrophe s, that's it is, you would never say the dog chases it is tail. That doesn't make any sense. So this is the only one that has an apostrophe. All right, number 9, should not becomes shouldn't, and car of my father becomes father's car. Okay, and number 10, most people find she's. Some people are tripped up by best student in the college, and that can be college's best student. So that's your apostrophes guide for grammar. Okay, new stuff. So on page 17 and page 18, we start talking about quotation marks. So quotation marks are these little double apostrophe doodads here, and we use them for a couple of reasons. Literally, just a couple. They're kind of like apostrophes. They don't have too many reasons why we use them. So on this page, we cover all the reasons why you'd use quotation marks for dialogue. So when we have a speaker's exact words, those are surrounded by quotation marks. I'm sure you've noticed that in books and stuff. Let's see, we have opening and closing quotation marks to mark where it starts and ends. One thing to note is that commas and periods are always placed inside the closing quotation marks. So you see how this little comma here goes before the quotation marks, and this little period here goes before the quotation marks. So that is a rule. So whenever you're adding your quotation marks, make sure you keep the ending comma and period inside. Let's see. If we have a dialogue tag, that's what this is called, Tyler replied or said Millie, then you will have a comma to introduce the quotation marks. Let's see. If you have split dialogue, so if the dialogue tag is in the middle of what someone is saying, then you use quotation marks for both sets, and you see you have little commas to help transition between those sets. And yeah, if you have multiple sentences inside quotation marks, that is okay, and that is normal. So for this practice activity, I think you'll find it fairly easy. The only thing to remember is that when you're adding those quotation marks, make sure that the period or the comma goes inside the quotation marks. If you put the quotation marks before the comma or before the period, that is not correct. Okay. Page 18 covers the other reason why we would use quotation marks. Sometimes you'll see quotation marks around a title of something, not a title someone is saying, just a title. The reason that those quotation marks there are because it's around the title of something short. And I use the term short kind of loosely, but if it's something written and it wouldn't take you too long to read, you could probably do it in one session, then that qualifies as a short thing. If it's something that you're going to listen to and it wouldn't take you too long to listen to, you could do it in a short session, then that would be a thing that would require quotation marks. So here's a list of all the things that require quotation marks: poems, songs, short stories, newspaper articles, and chapters in books. So the entire thing, the entire newspaper, the entire book would not get quotation marks, but that one little section from it would. So have an example sentence here. My uncle took out his book of fairy tales and read The Box of Robbers by L. Frank Baum. So obviously this is a fairy tale, and what's the title of the fairy tale? The Box of Robbers. So that gets quotation marks around it. So the only thing that you're worried about on this page are quotation marks for titles of short works. So don't worry about dialogue at all. That was the previous page. You're just looking for quotation marks for titles of short works. Okay, so in each of these sentences, there's quotation marks already in there. You have to decide if they're in the right spot. So if the sentence is correct, you can just put correct as is next to the sentence. And that lets me know that you see that it's correct and you're leaving it alone. If the sentence is not correct, if the quotation marks are not in the correct spot, you want to move them so it uses the quotation marks correctly. Now I'll go ahead and tell you that out of these 8 sentences, only 2 are correct. So most of them you're going to be making changes to. So make sure that you move the quotation marks to their correct location. Okay, so that's it for grammar stuff for today, just doing those 2 new pages. And we will talk about page 19 tomorrow. It's a very tricky page, so I wanted to save it so I could at least have some of you in class. So, all right.